I'm so short that you can either hear me or see me, and I'm going to assume that you are more interested in hearing me than seeing me. So hopefully we can do both, but don't count on it. If you don't see me, at least I hope you can hear me. I have to say that I'm an interloper in water. I have been drafted by many people who've been working on water to say, you've got to start getting more interested in water. So if I make mistakes and you realize that I don't know that much about water, it's because I am truly an interloper. So I want to apologize for this. Needless to say, I've been very inspired by Dr. Norman Borlaug with having worked with him over the years, and so this is just one of the several forays. I'm not going to read each of these slides because I have lots of slides, but I just want to emphasize at the very beginning that water conflicts have become so significant that even people working in defense of the countries are writing increasingly about the importance of water conflicts. And so these are just some quotations which on the one hand say we should cooperate, the others say we should get away from the complacency of denial that we don't have a water problem, and the others that water conflicts will be the defining crisis of the 21st century in Asia. Declining water availability, and you can see the huge difference in per capita water availability in countries, is leading to huge discussion, debate, and conflicts. And living in the US, it's very interesting to see all the op-ed pieces in the New York Times about California. 1% of GDP, 66% of water use in California, and lots of questions being asked about whether whether agriculture is using water efficiently. But even if it does, do the current cropping patterns in California make sense in terms of the future of California as well as world trade issues that I'll come to? What one notices at the global level is that the share of production coming from irrigated agriculture has increased enormously. 42% of production from 16% of area. In developing countries, the dependence is even greater. 60% of cereal production coming from irrigation. And I think one would have to say that R&D on rain-fed agriculture has been very badly neglected. And some of my Indian colleagues in ICAR have often written to me to say that more attention needs to be paid to rain-fed agriculture together with irrigation. Now, we were trying to figure out how the 318 million hectares of irrigated area could be divided in terms of types of irrigation. Quite frankly, the data are very poor, and my colleagues who are co-authoring this paper with me, we guess that maybe about 100 million hectares are in surface irrigation in large and medium scale. It's hard to define what the scale varies by countries. There is public plus farmer-managed irrigation systems. Their importance is growing over time, but again, the data are very limited. Then there are farmer-managed water systems, tube wells, sprinklers, drip irrigation, etc. The role of that is increasing very rapidly, as you will see, and many other forms of irrigation systems. Actually, ideally, we should know more about these different systems, and we should be doing more work on the ownership patterns and their impacts on quality of management, etc. Now, groundwater irrigated areas as percentage, this is reported in FAO data. I must say we had a lot of difficulty getting good, reliable data on groundwater, and I was surprised to see that the North American continent reports a very high percentage of total area irrigated coming from groundwater. And then if you look at the total groundwater area in the country, you see that South Asia is the largest amount of area under groundwater. And then what one sees is that there is on the whole a decline or stagnation of surface irrigation because of management issues which are tremendous. And then there is rapid technical change in all these areas, drilling of tube wells, sprinklers, drip, etc. And we don't know enough about the synergy between surface irrigation, groundwater, and therefore I was making hundreds of phone calls in the last 2 weeks to talk to water experts and concluded that the data on water are very limited. On the contrary, not only is the irrigation increasing, but subsidies in almost every country in the world. If water is not charged, and in some cases positive subsidies to water and power are leading to overuse of water in many countries. Now, I was trying to look for successful examples where there is holistic management of water, which everybody working on water intersectorally is saying is very necessary, because urban demand is increasing rapidly, and people in agriculture sometimes think they have an entitlement on water, and they're realizing that's not the case anymore. But although countries in their plans say that we are concerned about water intersectorally, quite frankly, when you look at what they are doing, you don't see much work which shows this awareness of managing water intersectorally. So we tried to look at some examples. And Australia, there are so many Australians, I don't need to speak any more about it. I'm told Australia is doing much more imaginative things. Israel in a very dryland context. China, on which I have looked into more, comparing China with India, is way far ahead of India in total management or looking at water in the economy as a whole. And Gujarat state of India has made some progress in managing water, but it doesn't really, one can't say that it's holistic water management yet. On the whole, I found that the research on these areas, and especially the impact of reforms on outcomes in terms of saving water, is very limited indeed. And I can now say that with some confidence, because I don't know how many people I have talked to, and they agree with me. There are very few independent studies and almost no studies which measure outcomes. But there are examples like zero tillage, direct seeding, etc. And then when you really read those studies, they say, well, zero tillage is really more about soil management rather than water management or soil water conservation. And then there is such tremendous diversity that you don't know a great deal about it. Now, if you look at area equipped, you can see that South Asia's area equipped has increased considerably beyond East Asia. But if you dissect the problem, you see that a lot of that growth in South Asia has been in groundwater exploitation. And Tushar Shah, for whom I have tremendous admiration, has done this painstaking work of creating this map which shows you where pumps are being funded, the electric pumps exist. And recently I did some work, more recent data, and I find that areas which are driest are the ones which are getting more rapid growth in pump sets. So I think there is an issue of sustainability. Now we also tried to collect data on sprinkler irrigation. Again, the data are very limited, partly because it's private investment. And again, we found that the US is the biggest user of sprinkler irrigation. But depending on the country, there is huge variation in the kinds of crops for which it is used. In most developing countries, it's mostly for high-value crops. In developed countries, it's for cereals as well. Similarly, we tried to look at micro-irrigation. I'm presenting these numbers not because they are reliable, but those are the best data we could get. And it's to highlight the fact that we do need to know a lot more about what is happening as a result of changing technology. Now, we know that as a result of expansion of irrigation, there has been tremendous growth in productivity, and we've been hearing about it for the last 5 days. What is interesting is that a lot of that growth has come from germplasm as well as from irrigation. But I think if I listen to the presentations, there is much less discussion of the fact that irrigation was a complementary input that contributed to this germplasm increase, productivity increase. The reason why I'm showing these and the other by countries is that China and Brazil have both have had very rapid growth in productivity, and a lot of Brazil's production is rain-fed production. So I think it goes to show that with investment in technology and R&D, we can increase productivity in rain-fed conditions. But I think in most of the rest of, particularly in Asia, the reliance on irrigation has been considerable, but you can see South Asia and India's productivity is lagging behind other countries. Now, the consequence of this, as you know, these are data from 1900s, been tremendous decline in prices, and the question is what will happen to prices in the future if we continue to exploit water without really accounting for it. The world trade has increased tremendously in cereals, and I show this to show that the U.S. share in world trade compared to Latin America's, it changed. Latin America's share has increased in world trade, despite the fact that they are relying on rain-fed agriculture because they have invested a lot in productivity growth. But we need to watch what is happening to water use from the point of view of global trade, because it can happen that if we don't monitor it enough, we may have sudden shortages in food production, and world prices could go up, and then we'll suddenly wake up and say, well, we should have paid more attention to water. This kind of synergy, I think in looking at the literature, this makes it very difficult to define, where does surface water end, where does groundwater begin, what is the synergy between rain-fed and irrigated. And also the tremendously complex trade-off between efficiency and equity. The whole debate on canal lining tells you that you can either do a lot for some farmers or more for other farmers at low levels of productivity, but getting many more farmers involved. And then it leads to the questions of short and long-term sustainability, which need more attention. These are the figures from FAO that we all use, 60% increase now needed by 2050. But when I was looking at other models and the impact of climate change, all the models on climate change say yields are going to decline a lot. There could be a big change in the cropping patterns over time. And then if I look at the 10 models which were compared recently, they show that maybe FAO's numbers of 60% growth, we may have to take it with more caution if we take into account all the implications for modeling. And one of the things they emphasize is that water use, nutrient use, policy-induced restrictions are not taken into account in these models. So I hope that, and the biggest finding is that climate change is going to have a big impact on projections, but I was talking to Phil Pardee yesterday, and his new model shows that that may not be the case. I'm emphasizing this because we need to look at models with caution and also see what the underlying assumptions are. FAO is projecting that there will be very little increase in irrigated agriculture in the future, only 6% by 2050. So this has phenomenal implications for what it means going forward. And if you look at where will the irrigated areas come from, it's mostly in Latin America, where there is plenty of land, and in Africa. And as I said earlier, it's quite obvious that Latin America could end up becoming the breadbasket of the world, because it's not yet so dependent on irrigation and its productivity is growing rapidly. So I think one big message out of this research so far is that increasing efficiency and productivity of water is of utmost urgency, and without regulation of water use, agriculture will continue to increase its dependence on water, and we must also look at food consumption patterns, which is becoming a big debate in California. People are saying, why are we producing alfalfa and exporting it to China? Why are we producing so many almonds, 85% of almonds in the world, using a great deal of water, etc. So I've tried to look at water issues at 3 levels. One is at the basin level. And the more and more I read about basin level issues, I realize that, large parts of the populations in the world that are poor and that require food supply are situated in basins which are cross-country basins with lots of transboundary issues. And these are just the numbers of the extent of transboundary water issues. You can see population density is very high where wheat is grown. And those are also the basins where there are a number of issues of negotiations among countries. So this is the Ganges Basin, and I've taken 2 examples, Ganges and Nile. And in both those cases, the analysts, economists who are doing modeling on the Himalayan basin and on the Nile say that if more information was available and if more systematic modeling was done, that could have very important implications for negotiations among countries. But so far the negotiations are based more on ignorance and more on perceptions of win-lose, rather than win-win, and therefore there is huge need for investment in information and analysis as an input into negotiations. I think someone, a Nepalese had said once that, it's hard enough for Canada, for instance, to be next to the U.S. But he said if you are a Nepalese, you are between 2 elephants, and if one of them rolls over, you are in trouble. So when you are dealing with 2 large countries like China and India, then the complexity of agreements on international waters becomes quite significant. Then we looked at surface irrigation issues. And these are old issues that people in the World Bank have known for donkey's years about poor management of surface irrigation and the fact that they are really not delivering what they should. And I think one of the key messages of the co-author of my paper, who is an engineer from France who has worked on irrigation systems for 30 years in the World Bank and all over the place, he says that the big mistake we made in the 1980s was we continued to rehabilitate systems that were not very well designed. So we shouldn't rehabilitate, but we should modernize. And that has completely different implications for how investments are allocated. And the main focus of that modernization should be on improving quality of service to the farmer. So you start with the farmer and say what is needed in order to make sure that the farmer has timely supply of water, and then see what its implications are for modernization. That's not the way a lot of the World Bank's investments have gone in the past. And I will show you later that the amount of money, for instance, China and India have more or less similar areas under irrigation. My Chinese colleagues in the last week sent me these numbers that China is investing 32 billion a year on modernization of the irrigation systems. India is spending 13 billion, and I don't know with what degree of efficiency, because if you look at this figure, which was done by Tushar Shah and others, expenditures have increased, but the area under surface irrigation hasn't increased because of inefficiency in those investments in India. Now, this is the World Bank lending. 32% of World Bank lending has gone to irrigation. And a great deal of that has gone to India. India was the largest recipient of investments in irrigation. 82 projects we could identify from 53 to 2013, and this is the performance of rated by the bank from 1970, I think, to 2013. And you can see that the performance among countries varies a lot, both in agriculture, the red is agriculture, and the blue is irrigation. So unless we improve the performance of the surface irrigation systems, about 100 million hectares in the world, 1/3 of the irrigated areas, we will continue to have problems in the water sector. And so this basically shows that India and China have more or less comparable areas under irrigation. In fact, the Chinese areas have declined over time. But there is a huge difference in productivity. And listening to all the scientists, I realize that these are simple-minded comparisons because they don't take into account ecological differences, etc. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that Brazil and China and Indonesia, by the way, their productivity has been growing more rapidly than in India. So this is the World Bank lending to irrigation. There is really much less investment in irrigation now, about probably 1 billion a year for the whole world. And you can see the relative importance now of national expenditures compared to donor-assisted expenditures, as was the case before. This is the IDB lending to the irrigation sector. Then the third part, so the first was on basins, the second part was on surface irrigation, and the third part we were looking at irrigation and transfer of irrigation systems to farmer managed systems, because it became a big movement in the 1980s, and there are a number of studies we looked at. But what they show is that the picture is very mixed. And there was somehow a view that, okay, if you give it to the farmers, things will improve because the public sector is not performing, let's turn it over to the farmers. But it was not always done very thoughtfully, and it was an expectation that farmers' organizations will somehow crop up and support themselves without much support from the management systems. And Tushar Shah, who's written quite a lot comparatively between China and India, often points out that China has provided, their farmer-managed systems are more advanced, although they started later than India, but they are providing more systematic support to the farmers' organizations than is the case in India. But these are some of the examples of China, Mexico, India that we need to look at more systematically to know what was the outcome of this transfer to the farmers. Because many studies I looked at, there's a lot of description of how this was done, but what was the end product of it? Was the operations and management improved? Was there more fees collected? Was there productivity increase? Was there timely supply of water? You don't get many answers to any of these questions by looking at many of these studies. So big difference is that China is investing a lot in R&D, and most other countries are not. And so you can see the result of that. And these numbers for Brazil are a little deceptive because Brazil is a much smaller country, smaller area, and better endowed resources. But on the whole, I think one other message is invest more in R&D, much more than we are doing at the moment. So impact of water management at the field level, dearth of independent evaluations. There's examples of where people claim that there is conservation of soil moisture, etc., but I didn't see anything that particularly impressed me. System of rice intensification has become very popular. Again, I spent nearly 3-4 weeks communicating with many people, and they said that the evidence needs to be looked at much more clearly. So the conclusion is that we are far from ready for 2050. Globally and at the country level, we need to greatly improve data and dissemination, substantially increase R&D, in which water and water use productivity needs to have a much higher attention than has been the case before. We need to improve incentives for water conservation. we need to focus on improved outcomes, not just describe what we've been doing. And we need to recognize, this is the finally important point I wanted to make, something called the Jevons effect, which means that micro-technical change can increase efficiency, and that leads to profitability, which leads to increase in investment. So we think that, okay, the technical change at the micro level will necessarily result in conservation of water at the macro level, but that may not necessarily be the case because of Jevons effect. So we need attention not just at the micro level, but also at the micro level on policy. Otherwise, we will have these outcomes of the continued differences in productivity growth. Thank you.